Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Readings from Oconomowaukee series. I'm Daniel Goldin from Boswell. We're with Lisa Baudoin from Books and Company. This recording is available to watch. We hope you will enjoy it and link it to others. So without further ado, I give you Lisa. Hi.
Hi. Welcome, everybody. Simon Van Booy is the award-winning best-selling author of more than a dozen books for adults and children, including The Illusion of Separateness and The Presence of Absence. Simon is the editor of 3 volumes of philosophy and has written for multiple publications, including the New York Times and the BBC. In reviewing Sipsworth, his recent novel, the Washington Post wrote that Simon Van Booy has performed another small literary miracle. Trenchant and beautiful, countless passages beguile and move us. Raised in rural North Wales, he currently lives in New York, where he is also a book editor and a volunteer EMT crew chief. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here with you both.
Would you like to sort of give us an elevator pitch or escalator pitch of the book, and then maybe give us a sample of reading to give us a flavor of the book?
So it's about a lonely but brilliant woman who's given up on life, really, because it's over. I mean, she feels like it's over. She's in her 80s, and she's just waiting to die, going through her routines every day. And then she has an unexpected encounter with a sort of lost pet. And the lost pet decides in its small mind to move in with her and become her best friend. So it's really about their relationship over a few weeks and what happens.
It is. Do you want to read a little bit about it?
Yeah.
Or from it?
Yeah, I'll just read from the beginning.
Okay.
Helen Cartwright was old, with her life broken in ways she could not have foreseen. Walking helped, and she tried to go out every day, even when it poured. But life for her was finished. She knew that and had accepted it. Each day was an impersonation of the one before, with only a slight shuffle, as though even for death there's a cue. Not a single person who glimpsed her bony figure flapping down Westminster Crescent could say they knew her. She was simply part of a background against which their own lives rolled unceasingly on. In truth, Helen Cartwright was native to the place, born in the old Park Hospital while her father fought at sea. The hospital was long gone. The brick cottage where Helen had grown up was still there. Now and again she walked that way into town. The front garden had been paved over, but cracks in the cement sometimes bled flowers she could name, as though just below the surface of this world are the ones we remember, still going on. Her home now was a detached pensioner's cottage with a mustard door. She had purchased it through the internet after living abroad for 60 years. A lot can happen in 6 decades. A place can change. But she hadn't changed. Helen realized that the moment she'd gotten out of the airport taxi and stood before the new house on Westminster Crescent. The home she'd given up on the other side of the world would have other people by now. She imagined them unrolling leaves of newspaper to reveal objects that were important or fragile, but in truth were just links in a chain that led you back to the beginning. No, she hadn't changed at all. She simply knew more because of all the things she had been through. And contrary to the fairy tales told to her at bedtime as a child, anything of value she'd returned home with was invisible to anyone but herself. After the taxi chugged back to Heathrow Airport, Helen had gone inside and dropped her luggage at the foot of the stairs. Like all houses, this place had its own smell that would disappear once she was used to it. On the hall floor beside her feet were letters addressed to someone she didn't know. She wondered about the people who'd been here before, tried to imagine their lives, but kept returning to the husband and son now far beyond her reach. Still wearing her coat, with the scent of aircraft cabin in the sea, and for coins forever loose in the seam, Helen walked through the kitchen and stood in the empty living room, stared out the front window. 100 times as a girl, she must have run, skipped, or ridden her clanking bike past this house. 100 times as a girl, without ever thinking it a place she would return one day to close her life in a perfect circle. On her 80th birthday, Helen spent the day moving things in the kitchen cupboard, wiping down shelves, vacuuming the stairs, turning from any face that appeared in the dust or the darkness between cans. 3 years pass with nothing to fill their pockets. And then early one morning, something happens.
That was amazing.
She's into present tense.
Lisa, I wanted to say, Lisa has your next question, but I just want to say it's been so much, this book has been so much fun. As you know, I've been reading your books for a long time. And
Yes.
and some are, some we work very hard to sell, but it feels like a little bit of a challenge. But what's been wonderful about this book is our buyer went to some buying meeting and he came back and said, everybody's talking about Sipsworth. And and I was like, oh yes, I've read it. But there's been so much momentum. It just really captures so many people's imagination and heart. And so when Lisa and I were talking about, we're always talking about what we're reading. And she told me that she and her book club person, Ken, had both read and loved the book. That's why we asked you to be part of this. And so anyway, I hope, we want to make sure that everybody knows about the book. And so, though we know you've done a lot of interviews, we're like, we just want to make sure, especially for the holiday season, that everybody that we can imagine falls in love with the book just like we did. So with that said, Lisa.
Well, I've fallen in love with your shop long ago. And you too, Daniel, I have to say. So and also anything I can do to persuade people to come into your wonderful shop and to meet you and Lisa, that's my dream.
Oh, well, we know you have a lot of friends in the book world, so they can all be divided up into all the wonderful places that they should go. Lisa has a question about the first sentence.
Well, I want to say too, this is wonderful because the pages that you've read, you can give the book to somebody and say, just read this. And it's not every book that you can say, read this passage, I know that'll be the hook. And that makes it so much easier. You can just hand it and read it and it's done. So let's talk about the first sentence. There's so much about first sentences and memorable first sentences. And this first sentence and the whole first page is so beautiful and so poignant. You want to talk about how it came about, its origins?
Well, I suppose I wanted to write about I don't really know. The book started in Paris in the 1930s, and it was about a man actually who was quite curmudgeonly, and he was living in Montmartre, and so I would have to go to Paris and do lots of research, and really raise my cholesterol in the name of literature. And but I started writing, and as usually happens, I have my typewriter, but Flannery O'Connor once said that she is God's typewriter, and I feel like I am the universe's typewriter. It's the same thing. So I have my typewriter, and the universe used me as its typewriter, and I just sort of moved out of the way, and I let the story that wanted to come out just onto the page. So it really wasn't that much. It was just like sit there, type, have a sandwich, have a coffee, take a break, go to the toilet, come back, keep going, and then don't mess it up by putting too much of yourself. Don't impose anything about yourself on it. Just let the story come out. The front end, as I call it, sort of as an editor as well, I rewrote a lot. I probably have 150 pages of front end, first 10 pages, just constant rewriting because I wanted to. I mean, I was talking to a 7-year-old years ago about books, and we were talking about one of my books about death and terminal illness. And the child looked at me and said, "Well, what you need is a hook." And I thought, that's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I do. And so I started looking at other books, like really commercial books, which I read everything, so, and they would have things like at 5 minutes to 4 in the morning, almost 12 pigs made it into the water. I'm like, wow, that's a hook. Why almost 12? Like 11, 10 pigs made it into the water? And why are the pigs jumping into the water in the early hours of the morning? And probably to escape some kind of roast. But yeah, so I thought all these sort of commercial books and children's books really have incredible hooks. And I thought, well, I'm gonna give a hook in my own way, which isn't really that much of a hook because it's sort of the end of her life, but it's the beginning of our experience with her.
But isn't it the hook is like we all know that we're going to have to reach that point where our lives wind down. And what has happened to this character? Yeah.
Yeah, and I see I work with a lot of people whose lives are winding down in that way, and a friend of mine who's an end of life therapist. When I first started, working with people who are older, 80s, 90s, I said to her, how do people handle, their eventual demise? And she said exactly the way they handled life, with compassion or with anger or with anxiety. It's the same. However you handle life is how you handle that. I thought that's fascinating. So I'm going to handle it with lots of chocolate.
Me too.
This book, so many of your books are in a way very different, but there are some through lines. This is not your first book that you've written about processing grief. It is certainly not your first book about connectivity. Did you see, as you were, you said the book came to you. I'm still trying to ask you, how did the man transition to a woman, and how did they move from France to Great Britain? But did you when you were right? I assume that you're not thinking these are the things that I write about, but it just seems like whatever kind of book you write, it's going to make its way into it. Could you discuss that a little?
Yeah, so my wife said, wow, Sipsworth is really quite popular. It's selling in foreign country. I mean, everybody wants to read it. And I said, don't get used to this. I may have messed up this time, but I promise next time it'll be back to normal. The inner workings of a strawberry or something, actually that sounds quite interesting. But so it's really, even though people say, you should write about this is what people are interested in, or this is what's trending, or this is what's in the news. I really got into the business to be able to just go down to the beach every morning and see what washes up, and then take it back to my typewriter and then see what happens. And then usually I'll be writing about, the bottle that I found on the beach from the 1700s. Then a story will take over where it's about somebody living in Scotland and, in the 1970s who's left a steel factory after an accident where he was blinded. Now he's living in a village. So what happens is I'll start to write and then I'll just be pushed by this force toward a story that I hadn't intended to tell. And if I know what's good for me, I go with it. Even though sometimes my agent will say, you really want to do a comedy about terminal illness? I mean, I don't know how many books we're going to sell. When Daniel talked about some books are hard to sell, I know he was probably talking about that one. But or do you want to really follow the life of a family in Kentucky for 100 years. So, but it's not really my choice. I make choices as an editor. So when the story starts to come out, editor Simon takes over and, like, goes and shakes his head and says, "Oh my God, what are we going to do now? Look at this." And then editor Simon sort of makes it into a story that will increase hopefully the pleasure and the intrigue for the reader. But writer Simon, doesn't really think about that too much. And Simon 3, of course, talks to agents and sort of does the business. And Simon 1 and Simon 3 do not get along.
But thank goodness there's Simon 2, the storyteller.
Yeah, the editor. Yeah, Simon 2, sort of the mediator between Simon 1 and Simon 3.
I'm seeing a science fiction show with 3 Simons in a room, split up. I will note that the Kentucky book, The 100 Years of Kentucky, Night Came with Many Stars, which is a wonderful book. And I have the biggest book club I work with chose it for their book one year, and they all came back. It was their favorite book of the year.
Oh, it's nice of you to say.
He's not just being nice.
And they all rushed out and got biscuits and grits and moon pies.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of when you're talking about going down and collecting stories, or taking the things from the beach and bringing up, is the moment Helen's in the grocery store and she's looking into carts and she's making up stories based on what each person has and what they're doing. And in that moment you see a sort of a reveal of the kind of person and character Helen is. But I now see it's possibly just a reveal of you as a writer and a collector. But that's one of my favorite sections and passages in the book, and it's on page 68 if anybody wants to quick run through and grab their book and read it. But it makes your grocery store trips a little more interesting.
Yeah, grocery. I mean, we live in an age of weather forecasts and supermarkets, so these enormous places, palatial, like stadiums of food. And it's, as a child, I'd go to the baker and then I'd have a list. My mother would give me baker, then you go to the butcher, and then you go to the grocer, and then if there's any money left over, I can go to the newsagent and buy a comic, which I always did, and then I come home with the different bags. But then supermarkets became the norm, where you go there for just everything, even underwear.
Yeah.
I just want to follow that up. Do you see, I was going to ask you about, like, many of your books have had like real life stories that you were told that sort of developed into the book. So being that you work with a lot of folks end of life, or, finding, who are trying to figure out what to do with themselves after things have happened, was there a particular incident that kind of led to this book, or was it really just like my fingers told the story? And obviously I can't ask you whether you're a pantser or a plotter, because that would be ridiculous from what you said. Like, you don't have this mapped out, I'm assuming.
Well, I because I write for a living, and I actually I was never a plotter. I would never write an outline. I would just feel my way in the dark. It's like, every night I'd put on my exercise suit and I'd go out into the street, into the fog, and just crawl through the night. And that's how I used to write, And but I spoke to Douglas Stewart, who I like as a person and a writer, Shuggy Bain, and Alexander Chi, also a lovely chap, and asked them, do you plot or do you write? And so, because I was thinking maybe I need to stop, maybe I need to find a median. So what I do now is I write for about 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 pages until I find my emotional connection to the story and what the story is. And then I plot the next like 10 or 15 chapters, just so I don't write in the wrong direction. What I mean is not writing badly, but writing away from the story arc.
Right.
So what I've learned over the years is that writing and writing a book are two very different skills. And somebody can write incredibly well and with originality, but essentially they haven't written a book. They just have excellent prose. And then some people have prose which is, a little bit predictable sometimes, where if you only see the first part of a sentence, you could finish it. It uses a lot of idioms or overused expressions, but they write a book brilliantly. I mean, they handle plot pacing so well. So as a book editor myself, I always say, look, you want both. You want your original writing that's just you, and has a nice variation. It can't be beautiful all the time. You have to have like a landscape and seasons. Every book has seasons, but you also want to really you want to be mindful of the reader's time. They're giving up 8 hours for you for this story, so you can't spend 50 pages talking about a doorknob. This is not 1830 where if somebody made a salad, it was like the big event of the day, and and didn't get smallpox. So now there's so many things competing for our attention. I think it's really important for writers to, I mean, if they want to sell books, to really just, first of all, they have to have that emotional connection to the piece, but then they also have to have something that, really pulls the reader along and is worth the reader spending 8 hours when there are so many other things, books, streaming shows to compete with.
Yeah. So sort of like guideposts, sort of for.
Yeah, I mean, young writers sometimes want to break the rules, and I love that. But it's good to know why those rules are in place to begin with. And if you do break them, what you lose, um, for instance, if you decide to shift point of view in the middle of a chapter, you lose that thread of intimacy that the reader has with the person whose point of view we're in, the incumbent point of view. And if you use first person, you get this wonderful, you're basically an actor, and you get this wonderful indulgent sense of, how it feels to be this person, but then you lose the ability to sort of float over the text and move things around. So that's the great thing about literature, is that, if you choose this, you lose that. So it's really always a compromise. There can never be like a perfect book.
Which is why people keep writing them, I
guess. Yeah, I think so.
So in this one, the other books you switch time frames, and this one is pretty much within a 2-week time frame. Do you want to talk about the challenges or the differences of writing both?
Wow, these are really good questions, Lisa. These are really hard questions. Yeah, I would jump around time frames before because it just seemed like the thing to do. But now I'm realizing is that it's actually harder to not jump around, to stay in one time frame, because the reader's eye is constantly on that person and the sitting room. I mean, and so if you're with the same character in the same place for 50, 60 pages, I mean, there's a lot of pressure not to be boring. So, for instance, that's why I had to switch to the present tense, because in the past tense, if she made toast, okay, great. I mean, if you're hungry, that's fine. But in the past tense, she made toast. It feels a bit passive because it's such a sort of small thing. But in the present tense, Helen, slaps to the kitchen in her slippers. She takes some bread and threads 2 slices into the toaster, depresses the button. What if it doesn't work? What if it catches fire? So there's sort of like mini drama with making toast in the present tense. Like, what if the toast pops up and she forgets and it gets dry and is no longer hot and the butter won't melt on it? Is she going to use butter or margarine? Can't tell you how many letters I've had saying, I'm surprised that Helen uses margarine. Do you use margarine? There's people out there who and then you're either in the butter camp or the margarine camp. And I've realized that it's like people who love Barry Manilow and people who don't. It's like there's two worlds, and I've received letters from people in both camps, and they really hate each other.
So the real question is, did she used to use butter and now she's using margarine because her life is winding down?
You see, that's a that's an acute observation. And of course, the answer is she used to use butter like we all did. Until her doctor's like, you should go on cholesterol medicine. Me? But ice cream, butter, cheese. So
Well,
yeah,
it's hard. So
she switches to margarine. I mean, I grew up with margarine because it was cheaper than butter. I didn't, I had butter once at my friend's house, and I was like, this margarine is like thick. And he's like, it's not margarine, it's butter.
you know, in Wisconsin, it used to be illegal to dye margarine to look like butter.
No,
We have a
really?
very strong dairy lobby.
When I was a kid, my mom had margarine, and I would go to my neighbor's house and sneak into their refrigerator and take slivers of butter and eat it
Mm.
because it's so good.
It's
And I
so
still
good.
use butter.
It's so good.
But
Hot bread, butter, and honey.
yes,
I mean, what else is there in life except maybe nachos?
no, yes.
So clearly, I noted to Lisa, I said, one of the weird connections I've noticed is that a lot of people love this book, but some of my most obsessive friends who have read this book and loved it were vegetarians, as Lisa is, as is several of the other people who wrote recommendations, but they're clearly not vegans because there's a lot of butter and
There's
cheese.
butter and cheese and Bakewell tarts. But it's those details, like, well, I was just going to go back to the timeline and really focusing in on keeping it in present tense. It's all of those details that you catch and you bring in, like going to the sink down, when the mouse comes and lives with her, she's using a different sink. All of those little things reveal the kind of person and the character of Helen. And you're so good at paying attention to these little, like the story about the strawberries when she's in the grocery store and she can't decide, and then she has a memory about strawberries. You realize that she was not a bitter person. She was a generous and kind person. And you reveal that by not saying it, but by just these daily tasks. So yeah. And I'm sure you were aware of doing that, but do you want to say more? Or
No, it
Daniel?
wasn't. Keep going. This is great. Is there any more? Actually, there's a scene in Brideshead Revisited by, Evelyn Waugh, where Charles Ryder, one of the main characters, has made a series of paintings, and he's having an exhibition in London, and his wonderful friend Anthony Blanche appears smoking a cigarette in a cigarette holder, and he slopes his arm around Charles's shoulder and says, "Oh, my dear Charles, come, let me explain your paintings to you." And I feel that that really is the case with writers too. Booksellers and editors will really explain this is what this author's doing, and the author's like, "My God, it is what I was doing. How do I not know that?" And that's why it's
Say
such
that
a
about art,
yeah, it's a lovely community of critics and writers and booksellers, and it's really a wonderful world that we inhabit. Yeah.
it's interesting though that like some that our interpretation of what you're writing, that we feed back to you, and you either say, well, I guess that could be, or maybe it is, or there's some writers who will say, no, the way I wrote it is the way it is, and anybody else's interpretation is wrong.
No, I'd never be like that. Yeah, I know some writers are like that, and Nabokov said that his characters were galley slaves, and that he would just force them to do what he wanted. And I think that's why Nabokov is technically quite brilliant. But I mean, I've never been able to connect to any of his characters emotionally in any of his books. They all seem like caricatures.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at somebody like Claire Keegan, she, I mean, her book, this just pure emotion from page one. And Michael's, her latest book, Held, it's pure emotion. I mean, what I mean by that is you enter her book enters into your private world and you enter into the private world of her story, and it's just this wonderful shared sort of intimacy that you do. I think that there's been a trend in America toward books that are technically brilliant and cynical. And unfortunately, if that was the norm, if all publishers wanted to publish was that sort of work, I just wouldn't be in the business. I'd probably be in retail. But but
I will say that there are some writers, I think, especially young writers, are trained to sort of be kind of cold a bit. And I have a good example of somebody who's changed, like, because a lot of writers also want to write different things all the time, as you do. Some people want to write, write the same book, and some people write the same book on the outside, some people write the same book on the inside, as I say. But following Rebecca Mackay's trajectory, one of the things she said about The Great Believers was like that she had decided to do what you said and kind of build emotion into the characters, and she had felt like in the past she was a little more cold about the characters' lives, and it seemed to make a lot of difference because people were I've read everything of hers and I love all her books, but there was some like a big change in Great Believers in that people were so emotionally connected to the story. So
yeah, I'm looking back to all the books I've read of yours, and there's always that emotional residue that comes up at various times. Like I'll remember a piece, I'll remember a part. It becomes a way of seeing the world or experiencing the world.
That's nice of you to say. I mean, writing, when people say, do you enjoy writing? I don't really particularly enjoy it. But if I don't do it, then I become quite incapable of moving through the world emotionally. I mean, I become too overwhelmed. Like I'll start crying at toilet paper commercials. So I just become sort of paper thin, and so writing allows me to sort of untangle these constantly forming emotional knots. So really, writing is a kind of therapy in the sense that it allows me to express I think it allows me to express sort of, I suppose, a kind of love that I wasn't able to express as Simon, maybe because people weren't receptive to it, or because it was somebody that I didn't have any contact with in another country. But anyway, I think that the best writing for me is where the author shares a part of themselves through the story that otherwise would have been hidden from the world. So sometimes, Claire Keegan's a friend of mine, and when you meet her, she's quiet and she seems quite stern, but she's a deeply kind and wonderful person. And in her work, you just feel this deluge of controlled emotion through the characters. It's just sort of, she's really a brilliant writer. I've been a fan of hers for a long, long time, over 20 years. There's some writers that are alive today, Claire and Michaels, and a couple of others who I just love so much. If I had to run the gauntlet to save one of their books, with like arrows and the swinging weight, I would do it.
It's been wonderful to see in the last couple of years Claire Keegan break out to such success, and as people who come to her lately think, oh, overnight success, you can vouch that that's not the case. That it was a long time coming.
Yeah, you see this with a lot of writers. I mean, going back to the technical master Nabokov, without Lolita, I mean, would he be a household name? I mean, like Pale Fire's quite good, and but who's read Look at the Harlequins? Who's read Ada? I mean, even literary people, Ada. If you said who wrote Ada, I think a lot of people wouldn't know. It's not a reflection on them. I think it's just that, if somebody, Neil Williams and I were emailing a few weeks ago, and I love his work. This is Happiness. It's a fantastic book. And he was talking about how, people look at the important thing is a writer's body of work. That's what's important, I think at the end. But often in a writer's career, there'll be one book that gets such a big readership that then they're okay writing whatever they want, for the rest of their lives. Like if you look at Liz Gilbert, Eat, Pray, Love, she wrote brilliant books before that. But really that book was what, made her into a sort of a popular writer.
Yeah.
These
While you're
significant
living, it
things
can be
is
a little tough.
lovely.
Yeah. It can be a little tough because you get known. It's a double-edged sword, because sometimes when you have a book that's phenomenally successful and then you get to write whatever you want afterwards, but sometimes they don't achieve the same success, and that, I assume, that can be sometimes disappointing because you lose.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing. I mean, yeah, that's a very good point. If you look at Ishiguro, Remains of the Day, but he's written some brilliant books since then. But I think people still go back to Remains of the Day, in some ways. There was the book set in the past, I think, in 800 AD or something like that. I've forgotten the name of it, but it really was The Buried Giant. My God, that was a good book. So strange and wonderful. And I actually did write him a letter a few weeks ago, asking him, did the success of Remains of the Day derail him from his next book? Did it cloud his process? I'm still waiting for a reply.
Oh.
I did include a stamped envelope with a British stamp on it, so I'm pulling my weight.
I will say that Clara and the Sun did particularly well. Never Let Me Go is also done. Some of his books do better than others, and I feel like even if Remains of the Day didn't happen, I think some of his other books would have made like a very strong impact. I love the through line that goes through some of Ishiguro's works that seem so different on the outside, but on the inside, he's still asking the same questions. Did you read a book that just came out called Five Star Stranger by Kat Tang?
No,
so it came out in August. I loved it.
Okay, I'll check it out.
It's a weird thing because I've now read two books that were similarly themed. And I like the other book too, but I like this one better. About rent a stranger, sort of like set up as a person who's a rent a stranger, who winds up, inhabiting all these roles for people for money, but winds up getting a little too connected to some of them. So.
Interesting. I'll check it out. Kat Tang.
I think.
The last two books I read, two books was Clear by Caris. I mean, I start about 50 books a year and I finish about 6.
Oh.
But
that makes me feel good.
Yeah,
yes,
you've got a ways to go to
about
be a bookseller.
6 books a year, but I'll read that book 2 or 3 times. So once I read it, if I get past 30 pages, then I'm going to read the whole thing, and then I'm going to start again and read it again. So I read probably 6 books a year, fiction, and then I read them multiple times.
Oh.
And then those books go into plastic mylar, and they go onto my special shelf, which is not in direct sunlight. And that's my nursing home shelf. Like if they're like Simon, it's time, I'll grab those books. And the last 2 books that made it up there were Clear by Caris Davies, which I thought was very good indeed. And I think the most underrated writer in the world is Patrick Langley, who wrote Variations. And he's published by New York Review of Books. And I think he's vastly underrated. I think he's a fantastic, really a brilliant writer. I mean, if he won the Booker Prize, he's the sort of person I'd be like, my God, he should win 10 Booker Prizes. He handles it's very hard to handle the long form, and he handles it very, very well. And I just think if you haven't read Patrick Langley, he's quite unique. Brilliant writer. I'm reading Daniel Handler's nonfiction memoir as well, called And Then What? And Then What? I think, well, and now what? It's really funny and wonderful.
He is a funny fan. So
So how do you go between the novel and the short stories? Did you set out doing a short story? Do you know when you start, or does it tell you?
It well, that's a really good question. I prefer short stories. Short stories are really my home. And if I had invested in Bitcoin, then for the rest of my life, I would probably just write short stories. Um, but because I have to make a living, I write some novels. But short stories are really where I'm most comfortable. Um, and but novels, the longer form, my novels are all quite short. But I mean, is they're usually under, apart from with the exception of a couple, the last 10 books have pretty much been around 200 pages or less. Um, so I'm not, because I don't like too much filler, in a book.
Mhm.
And
Do you edit out? Are the books longer? Do you edit the books out, or do they come fairly whole?
they come fairly whole, but I mean, so say for every 10-page section in Sipsworth, I've taken those 10 pages on my typewriter and I've gone through about 100 pages, from my stack of blank paper of just rewriting, rewriting, rewriting. So for every 10 pages, there's usually about 100 pages of that same material rewritten in different ways. And so for Sipsworth, say, which is about 200 and something pages, there'll probably maybe be about 2,000 pages from my typewriter. But it's not 2,000, it's not 1,800 different pages, like the cut scenes, where the mouse like shoots himself out of a cannon, and there's nothing like that.
Look, it's Mouse.
Yeah. Or like a nemesis mouse called Subsworth, a beard, you know what I mean?
Squeak.
Holding a pencil and an eraser. And so it's really 1,800 pages of that same thing. Like, yeah, so it's just a variation, really.
One of the things that I noted in the book, and I said, oh, this is very different. I said to Lisa, reading a book 20 years ago, because especially the second time, the first time I read it straight through, the second time I was like taking more notes. And so I just like your books that you love. I read it more than once. And I found all these little interests and details that led me to making deep dives. I'm like, Lisa, did you know there's a lawn bowling association in Milwaukee that's only like 10 blocks from the bookstore? Or what movie is this that he's talking about that he never mentions the title for?
Oh, Summertime.
Yes.
Have you seen it?
When I wrote to one of my friends who loves Catherine Hepburn, I'm like, tell me about this movie.
It's like you'll need a box of tissues. It's so good. And of course I had a mouse, so that was a huge inspiration for the book.
Yeah, I was going to say, tell us about the mouse you saved.
Well, I wanted to get, when our daughter became a teenager, she started to develop her own life with her own friends, and which was understandable. But I sort of felt like I'd been broken up with, and do you want to go out for pizza? No, I'm busy. How about tomorrow? No, it's not good. How about Friday? No, I'll let you know. You know what I mean? So as a teenager, when you're like, oh, just maybe the phone will ring, I'll get gas up the car just in case they call. And of course, so I sort of thought, what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I'll get a little friend. And I asked my wife, I was thinking about getting a little friend in the house because the goldfish Tinkerbell had died. And not that she was much good. Turns out she was a cannibal. We got two goldfish and she'd eaten the other one. So that wasn't, it wasn't very.
That's no hero of a novel.
No, definitely not. No. And and she died, and we did the right thing. But she was, as Arthur Miller might have said, she was liked, but she wasn't well liked. And from Death of a Salesman, But so then I said, how about a rodent? And she said, Simon, we live in New York. Take a bagel from the fridge and go sit in the subway and just wait. And anyway, so we didn't get a mouse, but then the pandemic started, and I said, can we, what if mice are just sitting in pet shops unloved? And so she said, yeah, let's do it. So I went to the pet shop, and I found the shop owner said, well, there's a feeder tank, and these are mice that snake owners buy, where they feed the live mice to their snakes, which seems a bit Roman, in the bad way. And so I thought, well, that's not, I don't know, it just didn't seem very fair, because in nature they have a chance to escape, like they can, oh, they can hide behind that leaf, or like, look at that beaver, and then run away when the snake turns. But so I thought it was a bit cruel. So I took this mouse from the feeder tank, brought him home, and I thought, I'm going to try and give you the best life possible. You're going to have treats galore. You're going to be like, I'll give you little velvet cushions to rest your paws on, and I'll make you a smoothie every night. And so anyway, I loved him, and I think he could tell, because after a few weeks, I put my hand into his home, and he popped into my palm and ran up to my shoulder and just sort of nuzzled my neck. And I realized, mice are capable of receiving love and giving love. And then so, we were just so close. And it turns out he had a terminal disease called Mycoplasma pulmonis. And so he wasn't going to live long. And I fed him every day with an oral syringe, a bronchodilator and an antibiotic. And anyone who's listening or watching this who's a pet owner, you know, that if your cat or dog or your animal is sick and they show you a picture of the moon with medicine on it, you'll find a way to get there, to get that medicine. And so it was the same with my mouse, and I had to drive across country for some work, and because you can't take mice on aeroplanes. So, unless it's a private jet. But as I don't know anybody with a private jet, well, I do, but we don't, we,
Yeah.
we politically, we're like,
Yeah.
So
you don't want to ride on the private jet at this time.
No. Yes. Well, I mean, I don't know. I know. Anyway, it's complicated, but I mean, to call up and say I've got a mouse and I have a mouse emergency. And anyway, so I drove across country, and it took 5, 6 days, and I'd smuggle him into the hotel every night, and we'd watch movies, and we went to we went to saw the sights of America. It was like a road trip, and we went to, the faces carved into the cliffs, in South Dakota, the Beatles. We went to see the Beatles, and then we went to Death Valley, and we saw, like, you were in the desert, and I took him to see the surfers, in California, and it was like a little Baywatch with a mouse, and imagine us like running down the beach, and well, he didn't really run, he just sort of sniffed, and but we had a great time. And then on the way back in Las Vegas, he died at a casino that I'd smuggled him into. I mean, there's so many horrible things happening in Vegas. I mean, mouse rustling is very low on the list. And so, like Elvis, he breathed his last, and yeah, I had him cremated, and I have a little tomb. And then, when I got back to New York, and my wife and I were just it was like, the universe had taken bites out of us, and we really wanted a mouse, but we didn't want a rebound mouse. So we waited, and then we went back to the pet shop and got a different mouse. So we've had 2 mice, and he lived a long life, over 2 years. And they had very different personalities, very different, just like us. So, I know nothing that Sipsworth does in the book. I mean, everything that Sipsworth does in the book, a real mouse is capable of. So Sipsworth, the mouse in Sipsworth is really based on real mouse action. It's not like I've imagined it. Like, this is based on my experience with several years, caring for mice.
Lisa, I think, did more of a deep. I did read some reviews and stuff, but I didn't watch the interviews. I'm like, I'm like, when I was like, what's the real life origin of the story? I'm like, oh, thank you for telling me now. So this all comes together.
Well, and in the book too, at the end, it says that you've saved your own mouse.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got photos of us like sitting watching movies together. I would be typing, writing, and he'd be on a square of toilet paper with a cashew. I mean, what more do you need in life? Cashew nut and some toilet paper.
Why isn't that picture on your cover photo?
Oh, I know.
That's true.
The UK edition did that. The UK edition put him on the
They did.
author. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know. We'll tell Josh.
or even you need to have some up on your website.
Yeah. And now more advice for you. No, I was Lisa and
That's
I
us
are
booksellers.
Lisa and I are members of the Found Family Book Club. And welcome to being our latest selection. I mean, we don't do this on purpose, but we're just so drawn to stories. This is such an excellent one because of the way that Helen has to bring in these other people in their lives. You are obviously a big fan of Community, and it does also weave through your other books. Can you talk about why that was important to you in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people are quite isolated the way we live today, and people are quite lonely. There are exceptions. I think New York is an exception because, people live in apartment buildings, so they know that on this day, on this month, this person is going to be cooking some bizarre dish that smells the whole hall. But that's their life, and that's what they do on this day, on that month, and you have to tolerate it. And then maybe when your cat is sick and you need someone to give you a ride up to the Upper West Side to the vet, you can ask them. So the thing is, it's like community is not just about, I suppose, loving everybody. It's also about tolerating everybody and tolerating them in the way that you know, people are going to do things that I think, are not, people are sometimes we're going to find them irritating. And I think if we could split ourselves into two, we'd find ourselves irritating sometimes. And so, William Blake, one of my favorite poets, said that in one of his poems, we're here to bear the beams of love. And I always thought that was quite good. If I was going to get a tattoo, it would say that. And I suppose for me, we're here to bear the beams of love. Beams meaning sunbeams. So we're here to bear the light and the heat of love. Because, Shakespeare in one of the sonnets, sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. You know, so but then the beams of love could also be beams because in the 1700s beams were known for building ships and houses, and so it's really true that I think love and community is also a burden. It's not convenient to drive that person to the vet, but it's not convenient to go over to care for somebody who's in bed for 6 months sick. It's a pain, and that's why it's a favor. That's why and I think, I think the more we do for others, the happier we become, even if it is not convenient, if that makes sense. Anne Michaels once wrote in one of her books, I think it was Fugitive Pieces, and I remember these things because I read the books over and over again. She said that in order to be saved, she had to give what she most needed. So in order to save ourselves, we must give what we most need. I mean, isn't that just so true?
Yeah. And I love how the scene takes place in the hardware store and that friendship that develops there. And it feels so much like what we do in bookstores. So hardware stores, bookstores have that similar kind of where you're solving a situation, you're helping to address a situation in another person's life, who's can be a friend or a stranger, but you get into an intimate space to help resolve that, whether you're recommending a book or you're recommending a solution for a problem. And I guess pet stores would be similar too.
Yeah, and that's why I mean, for me, bookshops are so important. Because it's like, when you go to the doctor, you talk about your problems, you tell her what's happening, and then, she helps by giving you hopefully some kind of a pharmaceutical, or sometimes you just, it's therapeutic. Sorry, it's a talk therapy or whatever. But if you were just to go on a website and type in your symptoms and get a drug in the mail, I mean, it's not the same as somebody saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I did have another patient who went through this, and this can help." And it's just such a big difference. So I always think books are a kind of medicine. And booksellers are sort of these cross between sort of magicians and physicians, like cultural physicians who will prescribe a book someone who's just lost their spouse of 40 years, somebody whose child has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, somebody who's, thinking about adopting a dog. I mean, I'm sure you could think of a book for that person that would soften the pain or would inspire them to go ahead and adopt that dog. Whereas you can't rely on critics, I don't think, in newspapers really, because I feel like it's just not a lot of modern literary criticism just isn't a reflection of the reality of literature. And that's a very complicated subject, but I feel like booksellers are the people who you can rely on most to recommend a book that will nourish you.
Oh my God, I feel completely inferior. I was if I was
You probably need more. You probably need more coffee, Daniel.
Yeah, I was feeling. I'm sorry, I was so distracted at one point when you was like, I was like, do I still have my copy of Fugitive Pieces?
I know. I was thinking the same thing, and I'm pretty sure I know right where it is.
I'm just hoping she wins the Booker. She's longlisted.
Oh,
So I wrote her a fan letter years and years ago.
has she replied?
Yeah, she does. Yeah. And she's just she's the loveliest person. I think she's quite shy and quiet. And I once asked her, when do you write? And she said something like between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. when my children are asleep and nothing can hurt them. And I'm like, wow, that's like that answer is better than most of my fiction.
Lisa, do you have a last question?
Do I have a last question that will not take too well?
The last question sounds like something from Beckett, doesn't it?
I know. Well, another appreciation is just how you do get to the essence of being human in your stories. In all of them, they've got sort of this untangling of very philosophical sort of thoughts of what makes us human, what connects us. And I appreciate that, and it's not a long journey. It's a very succinct journey. And you walk away feeling satisfied, like you're a soothsayer for the soul.
Oh, thank
How
you
do you
very
feel
much.
about that? No, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose for me, the essence of philosophy is in the modern times is, I suppose, learning to balance hypocrisy in ourselves and in the world, and just accepting that this is the best world we live in because it's the only one we've got. And we can certainly change it, but as of right now, it can't be any better, otherwise it would be. And it can't be any worse, otherwise it would be, which is a sentiment from the Tao Te Ching, by Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese text. So a lot of my ideas really are just sort of echoes of things I've read that sort of seemed sensible. But there's this evangelical strain of like that you must find the truth and you must use that truth in a way to leverage power. And I think that really brings out the worst in us. I think sometimes, I don't know, philosophically, it's okay just to shrug your shoulders and say, I don't know, but would you like another cup of hot chocolate? Even though we disagree on everything.
Wow.
Yeah. I know.
We're so excited about Sipsworth. We're grateful. We can't wait to read your next book too.
Me too.
Yeah. We have no idea what. And have you adopted any other animals that might make it into a book?
Actually, in my new novel, yes, there is an injured bird. But it only starts the book.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's another through. If we had 2 more hours to talk to you, we'd start talking to you about sentient animals in books. Because
I like Buddhas. Animals are like little Buddhas.
They are. Thank you so much for talking to us. We are very grateful for you and for the book. And
I'm very grateful for you. I wish we could all have lunch now.
I do too.
That's right.
I've got a great hot chocolate spot here too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
All right, that's it. I'm getting my car key.
Well, thank you so much. And I
Thank you both.
I love putting this book into people's hands.
Thank you very much. And I will hopefully see you soon.
Someday.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye, everyone.
Bye.